All right, well, why don't we get going? It's 2 o'clock now, and I know everyone has busy schedules, so we'll get right into it. I want to thank everyone on behalf of the IGES Institute for coming to today's webinar and exploring the impacts of video evidence on the criminal justice system. We hope everyone's doing well, staying healthy, and adjusting to the new work climate during these unprecedented times. Before we get started, I should note that all participants will be muted for the entirety of today's presentation. For those of you that do have questions, please direct those into the chat box, and Paul and Kay will address them at the conclusion of their presentation. We're hoping to have around 15 minutes or so to address those questions then. Before I hand off the mic, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, two very involved members of the IGES community, Csi Cohen and Paul Warmley. Kay currently serves as the president and CEO of Chopper Consulting. Here she provides a variety of executive management professional services where she excels at collaborative partnerships, relationship development, and bridge building between government, public sector, and private sector. Additionally, Kay specializes in prosecution, including trial advocacy training and enhancement of management of prosecutor programs and offices. Paul Warmley is the president and CEO of Warmley Consulting. He is an innovator and entrepreneur who has focused his career on the application of IT to public safety, law enforcement, criminal justice, and homeland security. Paul was a presidential appointee to the U.S. Department of Justice and previously served as the IGES Institute's first full-time executive director. So with that, I will hand it off to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex. We appreciate the introduction, and we're happy to be here and welcome all of you that are taking some time to listen to this topic. I want to first say that Kay and I want to express our heartfelt thanks and gratitude to all the people in justice and public safety and all the other domains who are serving our country in this time of crisis, and also to express our heartfelt sympathy to all of those who have suffered under this COVID-19 epidemic that we're dealing with. We wish everyone well. But you know, dealing with this crisis comes at a time when we need to keep hope intact and deal with the future. And this webinar kind of mirrors that idea. We need to think about how we can improve the operation of the justice system during these times when things get better and we have the opportunity to do so. So we are, very seriously concerned about how do we improve the quality of justice in America. I want to just give you a little bit of background to this. What happened in Nashville and Davidson County, and that we're using as the kind of test case for this presentation, is that the mayor and council some time ago decided to equip all of the police officers in Nashville and Davidson County with body-worn cameras. And the District Attorney General, Glenn Funk, realized that the mere availability of cameras throughout the police department was going to generate a great deal of evidence. And he knew full well, and his staff knew full well, that that was going to cause a problem for everyone in the criminal justice system, because that evidence had to be dealt with like all evidence. And therefore, there was going to be a cost impact and a resource impact for how to deal with that. So General Funk asked Kay and I to help them build a cost model and a way to estimate the resources that would be required based on an analysis that we would do to figure out what the impact was going to be on the entire criminal justice system. So we're starting from that premise, and I'm going to use some slides here to help us make this case to you and talk about the impact on the criminal. Are we still there?
Yes.
Okay.
Can see it great.
All right. So General Funk asked us to look at all of the affected agencies in the criminal justice system, starting with the district attorney's office and the but also the impact on the criminal court clerk, general sessions courts, the state trial courts, the sheriff, the public defender, even the Metropolitan Department of Law and the circuit court clerk, and the supporting services, justice integration services, as all agencies which General Funk believed would be impacted by this move to body-worn cameras throughout the police department. So we began by looking at trying to define the problem a little more clearly. What Nashville Metro Police had chosen to do was to equip all of the officers with body-worn cameras, as well as a number of vehicle-mounted cameras, a total of 3,240 cameras. Estimates from the supplier of the cameras and others have estimated that those cameras would each generate 4 hours per day, per shift of being used, depending on how you measure it, but at least 4 hours a day. And of that body of video, the various people have estimated that between 10 and 20% of that video will have evidentiary information and would need to be forwarded and dealt with by the criminal justice system. So in that case, we're talking about over 1,200 hours of video per day that would be generated and brought to the attention of the criminal justice system. So what General Funk asked us to do was look at the requirements for the criminal justice system to deal with this evidence, to assess the processing practices that would have to be put in place, and then to really focus on the budgets related to the review, analysis, and handling of video and audio evidence as it is collected from both body-worn and vehicle cameras. And leading up to then the preparation of a cost model, which they could be used repeatedly to refine and estimate the total cost for implementation in terms of all the resource impacts on the criminal justice system, and giving them a tool basically that would allow them to develop a detailed budget estimate that was defendable on the basis of some analytical premise for doing so, but really then giving that capability to provide a basis for staffing plans throughout the criminal justice system. So what Kay and I proposed to do and began was to, first of all, look at the experience in other jurisdictions that were somewhat comparable to the size of Nashville and Davidson County, particularly exploring what other prosecutors had done with respect to this, but also other criminal justice agencies, not particularly focused on the many police agencies that have implemented body-worn cameras, but more on what was the impact that other criminal justice systems experienced by the introduction of body-worn cameras. We also then reviewed all of the affected organizations that I just mentioned and spent some time talking about how they perceived the operation would be handled in Nashville and Davidson County, and how that would then be able to be compared with the experience of other jurisdictions. And after that, we spent some time trying to prepare a pretty practical, down-to-earth cost model, and with all the supporting formulas that would allow us to give a tool to the criminal justice folks in Nashville and Davidson County to allow each of the participating agencies to make their own budget forecasts on what the impact was going to be of the introduction of this rather remarkable change in the generation of evidence. So we learned a lot from the work that we've done and with respect to the experiences of other jurisdictions throughout the country. And we had some very interesting and detailed conversations with a number of prosecutors, and Kay did this research to give us some idea of how to come up with the parameters that we could then later use in a cost model. So Kay's going to take you through what we learned and what we found in this nationwide exploration. Kay?
Thanks, Paul. Just to let everyone know, some of you know me. I recognize some names. I am the former executive director of the National District Attorneys Association. And before that, I was the deputy executive director at the National Criminal Justice Association, which kind of served in the very beginning as an incubator to the remember back in the day when Bob Shoemate sat in our conference room and was working on creating this amazing organization. So it's terrific to see what great things the IGES Institute is doing and how robust your membership and your leadership are. And also, my fault, I should have told Alex, my last name is French, so it's pronounced Chopard, and my company is Chopard Consulting. So some of the benefits that came out are probably things, for those of you who've done your homework, you've seen that have been raised in other programs. But it was clear that there is an opportunity for greater transparency with the community and greater accountability for what law enforcement is doing, what their interactions are, and for, in many ways, for both private citizens and law enforcement to perhaps be on their best behavior. The literature that we reviewed, and we not only interviewed people, but we also looked at the volume of literature available, sort of says it's kind of a mixed bag. Often the accountability and the transparency are very evident in the beginning, but may change over time. But that is still a benefit. The other thing about mobile video is that it offers an opportunity for training, in particular for law enforcement, where supervisors can look at things and say, this is the right way to handle a situation, or here's a way to handle this situation better in the future. So it's a nice added benefit of creating video that then can be used internally to educate and continue to improve the professionalism of the officers. The other thing that can't be argued is that it can be used to enhance investigations. And that is true for law enforcement. That's also true for the prosecutor when they are take over the case and begin to coordinate with law enforcement. So there are many ways in which mobile video actually helps to enhance those investigations. Let's move to the next slide, Paul. At the same time that we found these benefits, and as Paul said, I talked to many prosecutors' offices around the country. I talked to both elected prosecutors as well as some of the folks who were charged with managing whatever kind of body-worn camera or mobile video evidence program the office had. I looked for offices that were similar in size or were similar in terms of the number of cameras that were deployed in the field. And there were several things that came up. We've talked about this as negative consequences. For some of these, it raised concerns. So one of them, again, probably something you've heard before, is the long-term financial investment. Often the cameras themselves are not very expensive. The infrastructure to support them, the storage of the video data can be very expensive. And when you begin to look, many of the prosecutors that I spoke with said they had budgeted for sort of 5 years out, and they realized by the time they got, not very far along, even before the 5 years, they had not budgeted sufficient funds. So it ends up being a pretty substantial financial investment, which I think many jurisdictions have to weigh. Are the benefits there that it's worth this kind of commitment down the road? The other piece, and connected to that, is we often think of the financial investment as being in equipment. But what we found is that in many jurisdictions, that financial investment is also about time and personnel resources. And let me just explain a little bit about that. We were very pleased that the Nashville folks, and I mean this across all the stakeholder groups, we're sort of beginning this a little bit more together, if you will. I talked to multiple prosecutor offices across the country. None of them had had advanced conversations or preparation with their law enforcement agencies. So they were all playing catch up. And I think, frankly, that meant sometimes they were having to spend a little bit more money than perhaps if they had been able to talk and plan it more across all the stakeholder components, including the courts. So they, I think, in some ways were at an advantage. However, the time and personnel resources was pretty huge. And I think Paul did a fabulous job of coming up with this cost model, trying to figure out how can we budget this? How can we plug things in? But one of the things was to try to figure out, you saw he started out with what the police agency's estimates were of how much video, what the hours were going to be, and how much of that would be evidentiary and so on. Then we had to turn around and say, so for the prosecutor, how much time does it take to review video? For the prosecutor, what are going to be their legal responsibilities that they will have to make sure they do with this video, and how much time will that take? So one of the things that we discovered is that on average, and this was consistent, I mean, I called from New York to California and every place in between, was pretty consistent that for about every hour of video, evidentiary video from law enforcement, it would take prosecutors' offices approximately 4 hours to review it and redact it appropriately. And so let me talk a little bit about that. For some offices, that may not be as difficult as others, and I'll try to explain. So for example, I talked to one jurisdiction who has in their office a staff of IT staff on the prosecutor's office of 27 people. Nashville, the prosecutor's office, did not have an IT office, and they had no personnel whatsoever assigned to do any kind of IT. So right off the bat, we knew that that was not going to be apples to apples, and that they were going to have to figure out, how do we do this when right now we don't have anyone doing anything like that? And then the other question, which we'll talk about some more in a minute, is, who's going to review this? Who's going to be doing the redacting? Are we going to be asking our assistant district attorneys to be doing this work? So let me move to the next thing, victim and witness safety. The other thing that came up, and this was true in all the jurisdictions, is the potential to put victims or witnesses at risk for their safety. And there's a couple of ways to deal with this, but let me just describe some of the things that come up. So for example, sometimes you'll have situations where there will be people in a video that previously would not have shown up in a paper report, right? In the paper report, the officer is taking the names of all the witnesses or the victims or whatever, taking that information and putting it on the paper. In a video, you get whatever the camera sees. So let's say there's a drug buy at the local 7-Eleven, and in the background of the video is a minivan with 3 little kids and the license plate of the minivan showing, that are just waiting on a slushie from mom. Now, if I'm mom, I probably don't want my kids or my minivan and my license plate on some kind of a gang drug bust and to be out there for others to see, right? So that falls to the prosecutor to make sure that if there are innocent bystanders, we are not sharing sensitive information or information about them. By the same token, there are many situations where witnesses are put at risk. It could be confidential informants who might be included on there, that we want to protect them. It could be juveniles. And most states have laws that say juvenile information, including pictures of them, are to be held confidentially. Can't share those, not with the press, and also other limitations. And that kind of moves us into the next part about privacy concerns and sensitive situations. If you have an assault, or maybe you have a sexual assault, and you are going to, you, law enforcement officer, have to go to the emergency room. Well, everyone else that's in the emergency room, as I said, in a paper report, wouldn't show up. On a video, they're probably all being seen on the video. All of them are entitled to confidentiality. All of them have privacy rights under HIPAA. All kinds of other statutes come into play. So all of a sudden, there are things that are sort of unintended consequences, but have the ability to harm your victims or your witnesses. One of the things that we saw was that it can put a domestic violence victim at greater risk for not only more violence, but raise the likelihood of a lethal assault once those kinds of videos are shared. So the prosecutor has to think about all of those things, and typically it is their job, if you will, to enforce those laws. So as an example, most states today have privacy laws, right, that say you cannot give out personally identifying information. Well, that typically would include a video. So law enforcement officer is getting information from witnesses, your name, your date of birth, your address. By statute in most states, that personally identifying information cannot be given out. So now, how do we protect that when it's now on a video? In many states, for example, in Tennessee, the Tennessee Constitution, the state constitution, has a Victims' Rights Act. And the Victims' Rights Act says that the victim is entitled to certain, privacy rights themselves, to what happens with their information, to what gets shared publicly, all kinds of things, which are appropriate. And they're terrific that they're in that Constitution. But the prosecutor is typically the one to enforce those constitutional rights. So the prosecutor is looking at what are my state statutes, and in Tennessee, they have a statute protecting personal identifying information. They have a state constitution that says that they will protect the victim's rights. And on top of that, you have the US Constitution, in which the US Supreme Court has said that the prosecutor is essentially the one responsible for protecting the information and for having knowledge of everything that would be included in a police report, which means knowledge of everything included in a video. So there's a lot of different places where the prosecutor has the role and the responsibility. And the Supreme Court has typically said it doesn't matter whether you knew exactly, sorry about that, whether you knew exactly what was said or what was in a police report, you're still charged with that responsibility for knowing. So anyway, so those are a lot of the concerns that were raised. And then the other piece of that, the Csi effect, which I'm sure you all have heard of before, that often happens in the courts. One is the expectation of the jury that they're going to see video, but not always an understanding that the video you see on TV is not what you're going to get in the field, right? In the field, there's one camera. If the camera is pointed one direction and the officer's face is pointed another direction, you won't see what the officer sees, you'll see what the camera sees. So trying to help juries to understand that difference. And also one of the things, as Paul mentioned, we talked to all the stakeholder groups, was really the technology facing their courts. Their general sessions courts, which are their misdemeanor courts, for example, really were not set up at this point to be able to even show any kind of video. So the technical capability of the courts was really going to be a real issue. Can we move to the next slide? So what Paul and I did was to look at the benefits, to look at some of the issues and the negative consequences that were coming up, to try to figure out, could we mitigate some of that with policy and looking at the policy implications. And I certainly did that by talking to all these different prosecutor offices to see either what they recommended or ways that they had found to try to reduce their costs by developing policy that would make a difference. So you'll see this first one here was about how the video was handled. So for example, all of the prosecutors said, make sure that you ask the officer to tag the video according to what's relevant to a specific arrest. So if there was a specific arrest made, so now it becomes evidentiary video, tagging that so that it's easy for the prosecutor to find it and easy to marry up with that arrest and that police report. Without that, it basically would mean the prosecutor's office would have to view all the video from one officer for every day. Whereas this, so you saw, so they had 4 hours of video, but actually 40 minutes of it was evidentiary, that really helped them focus. So that was one of the recommendations. Another one was to really be able to have an audit trail to figure out who has viewed this, who has changed it or not. And much of that was looking at what's in the software that accompanies or that you are able to bring in to kind of track what's happened to this. Has the defense attorney viewed it? And did they make any changes? Who else has viewed it, and so on. Redaction and review, I mentioned that earlier. I think this was one of the greatest areas of concern for all the prosecutors. And I'll talk in a minute about the ways that some offices have tried to mitigate it, but what was universal is that because there are so many legal issues, like I mentioned to you before, right? Statutes, state constitution, US Constitution, case law, US Supreme Court case law, all of those, everyone really stressed how important it is. There has to be a legal review of the video and a determination made by that legal reviewer about what needs to be redacted. So what are the privacy rights? Whose are they? How do we enforce that? What do we need to do to that video to make sure that we're not releasing something in violation of any law or in violation of any of the constitutional duties and roles of the prosecutor's office? So a couple things that other jurisdictions have done. One, you see this differentiating types of cases. So in some jurisdictions, what they've done is they said in gang-related cases where witness intimidation is a huge factor, or where witnesses might disappear, suddenly become unavailable is critical. They handle those videos a little differently than they do some others. The same was true in domestic violence cases. In domestic violence cases, they also handled those a little bit differently in order to ensure the safety of the victim and any witnesses. So that's one of the policy considerations. Are there certain cases where those videos are going to be handled with a different procedure, and what that is, that procedure, and what's the justification for that, right? Because you would expect that that might be questioned by defense attorneys. So it can't be something that's sort of arbitrary and capricious. It really has to have been thought through about why we need to treat these differently. Some jurisdictions are using protective orders, and essentially it's like a blanket protective order in which they ask the defense counsel to sign, saying that they will not share the video with anyone, and often that would include the defendant, but that they will show it to the defendant, they will not make video copies, and that they, understand that everything that's in there that should be confidential, they can't share. And some jurisdictions have felt that that has worked well for them. I did not find any jurisdictions that were tracking whether there was still witness intimidation or victim safety or any of those issues. So they weren't collecting a lot of data about that, but they thought that had been a workaround for them. There were other jurisdictions that felt that that was an abrogation of their duties, and that really to fully protect victims and witnesses, they just chose not to release anything until it had been reviewed and redacted. So that was handled a little bit differently, but that has the potential to be a policy decision that you can make. The choice of personnel for redaction. So in most jurisdictions, not all, but in most, the prosecutors actually brought in media specialists. So while the prosecutor or sometimes a paralegal would have reviewed the video to see what needed to be redacted, they actually hired video specialists who, have expertise to actually do the redaction, to physically do that work. They were paid a little less than their lawyers. And also they were just faster. I will confess, when I went to law school, we did not learn about how to do this kind of thing. And so they were able to get to it more quickly, which means that they would be able to release video more quickly for discovery purposes, any FOIA requests, and so on. So many jurisdictions highly recommended that. Again, for jurisdictions that may already have some kind of IT staff that may be easy to absorb. For those jurisdictions that don't have anything like that, probably will mean bringing on new personnel. But many offices felt that you still have to have the legal review, but having personnel with expertise in that was very valuable. And then the last thing was really the importance of collecting data going forward. And part of the reason for putting this under the policy implications is because it's important to be thinking about that at the start of the program, or, you know, wherever you jump in. So if the program's already started and you're playing catch up, start collecting data then. Because what you want to know is it really taking 4 hours for every hour, 4 hours to review every hour of video? Or is it something else? Is it 6 hours? Is it 2 hours? Is there a difference between misdemeanor cases and felony cases? Is there a difference for cases that we're actually know are going to trial versus those that we will engage in some kind of plea negotiations? There's all kinds of things to be collecting data on. So the Nashville Police Department estimated 10% of their video would be evidentiary. Did that turn out to be true, or was it something smaller? So, and then the last thing that we also really, every prosecutor's office that I spoke to highly recommended deploying cameras in phases. In other words, as Paul pointed out, the Metro PD wanted to release about 3,200 cameras. And everyone said, don't do that all at once, right? Start out either by precinct, or maybe you do it by only impaired driving officers, whatever you decide, but don't try to bite everything off at once. And that's why some of that data you're collecting will be able to inform as you continue to deploy the program. So that's all of the different implications, things that we learned, and ways that we had to review the law in Tennessee in order to really be able to do a thorough analysis. And then I'll let Paul talk a little bit more about the resource implications.
So what we found in the review of the literature and Kay's interviews with the prosecutors is that there are serious impacts and potentially huge costs involved in the criminal justice system dealing with this evidentiary information. So in normal good operations research style, we tried to break this down into the component costs and resources that are going to affect everybody. First of all, there's technology costs. There's, if people are going to review and redact this video information, they're going to need computers. There has to be possibly improved network capacity, because now you're dealing with large bandwidth requirements to circulate all this information. There's the cost of storage that Kay mentioned that we found to be kind of a shocker for many jurisdictions. There's software, particularly to help do the redaction process, to identify those parts of the videos that need redaction. In the courts, as Kay also mentioned, some of the courts don't have the capability to display the videos and make those presentations. But the really huge impact and throughout the criminal justice system is on labor. And we tried to break down the processes, and working with the agencies in Nashville and Davidson County to get their concurrence on this. What are the component work processes that have to be undertaken to handle this evidentiary information? Someone's got to work with the police department to get the videos and bring them to put them in the right form to be handled by the prosecutor or whoever. There's got to be somebody that administers that whole library of digital video. There's going to be technical support to the people who are doing the redaction and review. They have to be trained. Then the review process itself of looking at the video to see whether or not there are any privacy or confidentiality issues. Then redacting where that's necessary. And then the distribution of copies to the defense attorney, the public defender, who's ever justified under discovery to get that, to see that video. Sometimes there are transcription services required for the audio portion. And then in some cases, there's always the translation services where you have multiple people involved that may not speak English. or may have English as a second language. And then many of the jurisdictions told us that a real serious amount of work goes into satisfying freedom of information requests from particularly the press or the public. So with these are the kind of components that we use to come up with a cost model. And we came up with this formula, which is nothing spectacular. It's pretty straightforward. We looked at trying to come up with a cost that's estimated for the annual cost by looking at how many hours of video are you going to feed these processes with, and then taking each process that I just previously identified, looking at how many hours of work is required for each process, and then multiplying that hourly work in hours of video by the annual cost of a person, including not just salaries, but fringe benefits and overhead that are appropriate. And then dividing that all by the number of productive hours that people can spend, which will end up giving us the cost for the annual cost for handling this data in any given organization. We estimated that, you can't really get 8 productive hours a day out of any knowledge worker, and we came up with a proposal of using 6 hours a day as a good target, which some people feel is high, but the folks in Nashville and Davidson County agreed with it. So we then set about to try to populate some cost models for the various components of the criminal justice system in Nashville and Davidson County. And we built this simple spreadsheet. Over in the blue section here, you can find the assumptions that we made, the labor hours available, and then looking at the breakdown of these functions. What is it going to take to do the liaison with the police department, and how is it, what's it going to take to do the hours of review for each hour, the 4 hours for redaction for each hour. We estimated 20% of the video hours would be dedicated to copying and distribution, discovery, preparation, transcription. The transcription and translation services were actually numbers we got out of Nashville and Davidson County's previous year budgets. And then the hours per FOI request. So these are all the parameters over here in blue. And we started all this with building the model so that we could put in the annual video evidence hours submitted by the police. And this is the most important independent variable in this model. But starting with that, then we use these factors to come up with the formulas to say, okay, how many FTEs will it take to do these various functions? And then we got data from the county on the average fully burdened cost for the people that were going to be doing this kind of work, and multiplied them out to come up with the total cost. So now this is all based on how many video hours are you starting with. We took a look then at the arrests, and because as you all well know, every one of you on this call knows that not very many offense incidents are actually taken or result in video. A lot of the video comes from arrests. So we started with the arrest data from the prior year, and we found that there were 53,904 potential hours of video per arrest, again, based on the factors of 2 hours of video per arrest at 0.8 of an hour for misdemeanors and citations. And that gave us a total estimated hours. And we looked at several different alternatives. We take that number of 53,904 and plug it into the cost model, 53,904, and hit the enter button, and it calculates out the total cost for the year for the district attorney is $28.9 million. That's just the labor cost, and we added to it the technology cost to figure out how many computers you need, using in the formula the factors that came from Nashville and Davidson County, a storage network estimate based on an estimated cost for what's going to take for them to do that, the software for redaction, it comes out with a nice round $30 million. If the prosecutor was going to fulfill all the constitutional and legal obligations that the prosecutor has, well, as you might imagine, this number caused quite a bit of heartburn. So we looked at some possible other models, like suppose that the policy was that we would only look at DUI and domestic violence videos, and that would then cut that number to 22,660. So then you can go back to the cost model and say, okay, 22,660, that would then give us a total of only of $13 million. These numbers are very high in a jurisdiction like Nashville and Davidson County, where they were already in a $40 million budget deficit when we started this project. And so these kinds of numbers are not very interesting. But it does give them a model so that as you begin to get a better handle on how many hours of video evidence is created, this model lets you calculate a budget that's defendable, because all these parameters that we came up with are based on actual experiences of other agencies. For example, the Virginia Commonwealth attorney has come up with this factor of 4 hours based on tracking actually what it takes to do the redaction. So we're pretty confident these numbers are realistic and practical expectations, but it does highlight the fact that this stuff is a very expensive proposition. And then, you know, it led the district attorney to try to figure out some ways to do a better job to figure out how to handle this. We did the same analysis for the public defender and looked at their workload, and the starting point there is to look at the work that they would have to do for the rest that come to them, and they don't really have to do the same kind of work the prosecutor does, assuming the prosecutor does its work. So those numbers assume that they're just going to do the review. They don't have to do the redaction, assume that it was already done by the DA in the court. So they need, when this is all said and done, something around $12.9 million instead of the $30 million that the prosecutor needs. And in Nashville and Davidson County, there's a policy that whatever the DA gets for funding, the public defender gets 75% of that. So this would be well within their obligations. We did a similar look for the courts, looking at what their obligations and work are. And we based this really on the number of trials that happen. And since that's really what the measure point of activity there, and figured out the same kind of parameters, looking at the fact that they may have to do some additional redactions, but on a smaller number of cases. They argued that they can't really assume that the prosecutor has done all the work, and they may have to be doing that too. But that comes to a $2.5 million for the courts. And again, these are using their numbers and using the numbers that we got from our national survey and the literature review, but also to give them some way to come up with a cost model. So in summary, what we really found is that the mobile video really has an enormous impact on the entire criminal justice system, all parts of it. It is costly, and it does require some careful analysis of what the policies are and procedures for handling the video. We know that inadequate resourcing can create risks and liabilities. You know, there's been a number of successful suits filed for inappropriate release of video information that have cost cities and counties a lot of money, and that some sound use policies are really essential to make this all helpful to the criminal justice system. So we recommended strongly that they develop these policies in a consensus kind of way amongst all the stakeholders and come up with an actual written concept of operations, which for the entire criminal justice response to this video evidence, which Nashville and Davidson County, we unanimously accepted this idea. And also to conduct a privacy impact assessment of the use of video evidence, to making sure they're handled all the legal and constitutional requirements. It's just a serious problem. It is costly, but if we're to do justice right, as the Attorney General in Nashville and Davidson County said, you have to take into account the requirements to do your job and to do what society expects of you. So it has to be done with care and some concern for what the impacts are. That kind of sums up what we did and found, and I can tell you that Nashville and Davidson County is now in the process of moving forward with all of this in the same kind of staged progression that Kay mentioned, and doing some pilot sites and then taking us to a larger implementation based on the findings in those pilot sites. And that's kind of where what we found, and we're open to questions at this point. So Erica Smith has one. What does the literature say about the impact of video evidence on the likelihood of conviction or some other measure of positive intervention? The efficacy of the video evidence should guide the use of it as a need for prosecutors. Yeah, certainly, absolutely true, Erica. Unfortunately, the literature has not really helped us much with this. There are very few research studies that we really found that carry forward the evaluation of video evidence into the rest of the criminal justice system. There's quite a few studies of the use of video in the police and the impact of things, but there is not very much research done on how this really impacts things like the efficacy questions that you're raising. I wish there was more.
I can speak a little bit to, it's true. It's not like we found any documentation to show that that was very well researched. I can tell you that between prosecutors and frankly, public defenders, one of the things that they thought was a benefit is that video evidence has the ability often to either implicate someone or exonerate them. I talked to one elected DA, for example, who was telling me about a recent case where once they reviewed the video, they realized that the defendant was charged with a felony who should have been charged with a misdemeanor. Because in the video, they realized that the elements of the felony offense wasn't there, but it was for the misdemeanor. So to him, those kinds of things are worth it, because otherwise they probably wouldn't have been able to make that determination till much farther down the line. And so he felt that it was positive because it helped them make the correct charges. But I think, there are many cases where they reported that once the video is viewed, there is no trial. So that for some, they felt there was a reduction in the number of jury trials they had because the video really helped solidify the case and led to often the ability to have some kind of negotiation on how to resolve it. And so, but Paul's right. We didn't really find anything where they studied, especially not in terms of the benefit to the prosecutor's office. And I didn't find a jurisdiction where this was started from the prosecutor's office. They were all started from law enforcement. And there are some things that have been researched certainly about the benefits to law enforcement. But as Paul mentioned, not really for the rest of the system, even though the whole system ends up being involved.
So it would really be good if the Bureau of Justice Statistics undertook some studies like this to look at the system impact of the use of video cameras. Can't resist telling that to Erica. So Melissa is asking the question of, is there a written paper that we can reference to review the findings? Yes, there is. If you go to warmlyconsulting.com, there's a blog post on evidence, the power, the weight of evidence, and in there's a link to download the paper that we presented to Nashville and Davidson County. It's about a 40-page paper. It includes the cost model basis and all the research that we've just described. And Todd Thompson says, will the spreadsheets be made available for sharing with agencies that are planning to implement body-worn and squad car video systems? We're, of course, interested in making these spreadsheets available. They're freely available. The basis for them and the formulas are in the report that you can get off my website. And we're happy to mail out the spreadsheets to anybody that wants them. They're not, we don't consider them proprietary. We've made them up as tools that prosecutors and agencies could use to make these kind of calculations. I think we're pretty confident that the parameters are good. So if you have a interest in the spreadsheets, you can email us, or I'll be happy to send them out to you. They're whatever use they are. One of the interesting things we found talking to prosecutors, most of them said, we wish somebody would create a little model that we could use because we haven't had time to do that. We're so drowned with all this evidence.
There's another question that came up about whether Nashville-Davidson County has gathered enough data to vet the models. The data, the numbers that you see in the spreadsheets, those came from Davidson County. We didn't make those up. So we use their actual numbers. So their actual number of arrests between felony and misdemeanors, their actual number of DUI and DV cases, their actual costs about what it takes to hire another person and get a computer and all of that. So we took the actual number of video hours from the Metropolitan Police Department. So we didn't insert any numbers ourselves. We took, the amount of time to review and redact video, we took that from other jurisdictions because they had not deployed their program yet. But I'm not sure if I'm getting to the question, but we didn't make any hypotheticals on numbers. We used what they had, or we used what prosecutors in the field had.
Yeah,
So,
I think the question was a little bit about, have they been able to vet these models yet? And there's a partial answer to that. They actually did have some sample experiences with one of the little towns in Davidson County that they have been getting some videos from. So other than this issue of how much video evidence is actually generated by the police, which it's going to take some time to flesh that out, they have been able to say that the models work. The staff in the Attorney General's office was quite sure that the numbers were pretty accurate in terms of how long it takes to handle the videos they get.
there's another question there about storage.
The cost model does include the storage of cost of sharing the video evidence. Yes, there's a network storage mechanism in each of the models. That's kind of a tough one to deal with because in many cases, agencies have chosen to use cloud-based repositories for this video evidence, but in Nashville and Davidson County, or the Metropolitan PD has decided to have their own storage facility. So they're buying the storage to hold all this stuff. There was not yet at the time of our study, the capability to really provide any separate storage for the criminal justice system. And they realized they had to do that. There's a figure in there of $600,000 for a storage network to handle the storage.
Can I just also point out the Nashville, Davidson metropolitan area, they actually have a justice information system, which they've had in place for years and years. So again, in some ways that puts them at an advantage because they already have a built-in system that all the criminal justice stakeholders have access to and use. Now, how they modify that, if they do, in terms of the storage, but it's a little bit unique because not all jurisdictions have an integrated system in the way that they do, and what they have is very robust. So we did not look at some of that because they were still having to work out where some of that storage was going to occur.
Any other questions? I think the timer's going off. I think
No,
we've,
that would be my clock.
I
Saying
think
5 minutes.
we've exhausted everybody's interest for the day. And I want to thank you all for listening and watching to this, and we're happy to talk about it. You all know how to get a hold of Kay and I, and through Alex or directly. We're happy to talk to anybody and explain what we've found or tried to do with this project. And we're happy to hopefully have contributed something to the knowledge base in the criminal justice field about how to deal with this new technology. So Alex, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Paul and Kay. And I want to thank everyone again for taking some time today to attend today's webinar. And if there are any questions we can help answer along the way, feel free to shoot any one of us an email or myself directly, and I can put you in touch with Paul and Kay. But that's all I've got. So thanks again, and I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Thank you, folks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.